Yep, so this is Brok and Sindri, and we're doing a review on Mass Effect Andromeda and why we think Mass Effect Andromeda is more of a spin-off than it is a main series game.
So sit back and enjoy. It's been 2 years since the game's come out, and we've had a bit more time to really stew and think about it and be out of the immediate emotions of when it's released. I guess I wanted to talk to you about it in a context both of the game as you know by itself, the game in the context of the Mass Effect series. Obviously, both of us, one of our most famous favorite series of games, and then to talk about potentially what can happen next, and to review it as a games review. Does that about summarize what we're going to be doing in this video?
Yep, I'd say that summarizes it pretty much perfectly.
Okay, so whenever we want to begin somewhere, it always makes sense to begin at the beginning. So I guess I wanted to find out how you felt when you first switched on. Oh, before we do, let's just tell our listeners and our viewers which format we played the game through on. So for me, I was playing it on a PS4.
Yeah, and for me, I played on PC.
Okay, cool. So now we've got that covered. The first time you turned this game on, went to play it, how did you feel?
So my first experience was back after having pre-ordered it and playing it pretty much day one. I was pretty excited. There was a lot of negative comments coming around, and the sort of storm was brewing, if you will, regarding this game. A lot of people were quite upset with like facial animations, that sort of thing. But when I first started it up, I was very excited, and I guess I sort of let it blind me a little bit. I sort of came into it without really thinking about how everything was actually like in reality. I sort of just expected it to get better, and because I obviously hadn't played the game before, and nobody had finished it yet, it was kind of easy for me to just blind myself and just go, push forward and enjoy it, despite some of its shortcomings. So yeah, I guess my first experience was quite a blind one. What about you though?
Yeah, so it was one of it came out obviously a couple of years ago, and I didn't have a huge collection of PS4 games at this point. So it was one of the early sort of AAA titles that I was really looking forward to. The one before that for me was Watch Dogs 2, which we'll talk about in another video, but basically it was one of those that I didn't actually finish the story of Watch Dogs 2. I just got a little bit bored towards the end of that one. So I was going into it thinking, I've been waiting a long time for a Mass Effect game. It's on the PS4. It's the first one on PS4, so the graphics should be good. It's on Frostbite engine, which I had a little bit of experience with, which was good. And yeah, I was genuinely excited for it. I heard a lot of naysayers, and I decided to not agree with them from straight off the bat. And yeah, so when it came out, you turned it on, and the title screen has that picture of the N7 helmet, and it was like, great, this is Mass Effect finally. And you get started with it, and that first sort of mission or intro, is really reminiscent of the start of the very first Halo game, where you're like woken up out of like cryo sleep. You're a little bit woozy, and you wake up to basically find that you're on this massive ship that's either under attack or whatever is going on. So it was really reminiscent, and in a way I thought it was a good homage. I thought they did it reasonably well, but then for me it just started getting back like disappointing, shall we say, a little bit from when you actually landed on that planet surface. And I mean, for me, as a storytelling device, for example, at the end of that tutorial mission, you're like, spoiler, the father, who is the Pathfinder, dies or sacrifices himself for you to live. And I felt like it didn't come at the right time. They hadn't earned the right to tug at your heartstrings yet. And so I didn't really care. And this is actually something we'll talk about a bit later on, but I think storytelling these days seems to be very lazy when it comes to that. They don't build characters enough for you to care. They just think, we'll play some sad music and we'll have a death like this, and you'll feel emotional, and we've done our job. This is a storytelling device that goes through, for me, movies, books, games, TV shows, all. And I think it's lazy, and I thought they took a bit of a lazy way that way. If it had happened a quarter or half of the game through, with your father dying, maybe we'd have a bit more time to get attached to the characters. But I felt nothing. I felt nothing.
Well, I think they also kind of built him, not necessarily as an arsehole, but I didn't find him a likable character. Like
Yes.
they didn't build him as like that sort of caring, loving parent. Like most of his backstory, you don't like. I didn't even find out until recently from, other videos on YouTube. So he is just sort of the character you don't give a damn when he dies. Like it really doesn't matter.
Yeah, and like I say, I do really like the homage to Halo with the that intro, that very first intro bit. I liked it. It wasn't Mass Effect as an intro to me. The first 3 games in the trilogy games all start in a really, really like you're in way. Like the first Mass Effect game starting with this discussion between Anderson and Udina about who's going to be the next Spectre. The second game starting with basically Shepard's death, being shot by the collector ship. The third game starting with the invasion of the Reapers as you've just been taken out of, I guess, prison essentially, or a jail cell, to speak to the Alliance Council. Like these are huge ways to start games. This one to me didn't quite feel big enough. And sort of on that, you introduced to the main enemy, or the main sort of pawn enemies, or enemies pawns, or whichever way you want to put it, and in that first, and I just felt a little bit underwhelmed. I thought they were okay, but not to be the main enemy that you shoot for most of the game. I thought they would be really good as this galaxy's Batarians or something like that. So yeah, there was that as well.
Yeah, my first thought with them, not really the first time I played through, because as I said, I was somewhat blinded, but definitely the second time, and on any subsequent sort of viewings of the game, you sort of expect them to be like a minor villain, because their motives are very unclear at the start of the game, and they're just kind of assholes for no real reason to your people. They break one of your allies' legs or whatever, and they're like beating him on the ground, and you get your first sort of like Paragon Renegade like actual choice option, except obviously there's no real Paragon Renegade system in the game. It's just
there's no
how you play it out. But there's no real consequences either way, because if you try to make peace with them, it still ends in aggression for no real reason. There's no depth to them. They're just aggressive, and I guess their idea was they were trying to build up this sort of mystery behind them, and you'd slowly uncover and peel back the layers as to why they're like that. But for me, it just it felt really flat.
Yeah, I agree. And so there's another point, and I don't want to labor on the original or the first mission, but there's another point here in the SAM AI implant, and like I know you've got a really good point to make on this, but one thing I just wanted to make was that it sort of was a little bit convenient, right? So there's this super high tech, alien technology from this other galaxy, so it's okay. Like if you're still in the Milky Way for this to happen, this next bit to happen, it makes sense, because at least in the galaxy, it's like the known world. It's like a language that could well be known, but you've gone to this other galaxy with this other alien species that we don't know. It's like first contact. We don't know their language at all, and yet the SAM AI can basically interface with their technology straight away. And that, to me, was a little bit like, okay, fine. Like, I don't know how that works, but okay, great.
It sort of overstepped the bounds of sci-fi and turned it into, I don't
fantasy.
even know, like fantasy, yeah.
So I know you've got a good point on the SAM AI as well.
Do you want to talk about that right now, or do we want to talk about it later?
Well, I think we can briefly touch on it now and then expand on it later. Yeah, that's.
So my main big issue with the SAM AI, which again, first playthrough didn't really bother me. I sort of ignored it. I had the goggles on, the nostalgia goggles, I guess, for the original trilogy. So I sort of ignored it. But it really started to bother me on subsequent playthroughs. The whole idea of this artificial intelligence that's not only fully unshackled, basically, like it's completely like it has free reign of a lot of important systems on the Ark and the Nexus and all these different places, but it's also interfaced with like human bodies who are also leading this initiative, But the worst part is that this AI was created, I guess, in between Mass Effect 1 and 2, or just.
Yep.
I guess we sort of find out later on in the game that Alec Ryder sort of created it for his own personal reasons. But so this is essentially a legal AI, which highly contradicts multiple different missions throughout the original trilogy. You've got like the Project Overlord missions. You've got that Mass Effect 1 mission on Earth to Moon. Like many missions where AI should not be allowed free reign because they almost always go completely wrong. The only time that this sort of lines up is with Edie, but even that was like sort of a very controversial thing to do, even by the time of Mass Effect 3.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly you just have Sam, who's basically Edie, but like perfect and interface with your body, and it just completely contradicts so many of the points made in the original trilogy.
Yeah. So I just want to make a brief point here, and this is maybe just as much for humor as for anything else. We'll talk about this later because I do want to get stuck into actually maybe characters. Well, first of all, I want to touch on this. The graphics in this game were amazing. I believe were amazing. I did buy the original launch PS4 version, but I never had any of those issues, or maybe I just didn't notice any of the issues of the facial effects, the facial expressions. Could have been. So I personally never really saw that. I was fine with the way they did it. So that's where I'm at with that. Graphic wise, it's a beautiful game, and even like recently I've been playing through it again, or trying to, should I say, to refresh memory on this, and even now the graphics, like even in light of the God of War and Red Dead 2 that have come out as two of the most beautiful games, this one still stands up to it, and it was released a year before God of War and almost 2 years before, or a year and a half before Red Dead. So graphically I have absolutely no complaint here. But I do want to get into the characters because we've introduced obviously Ryder as the main character, Alec Ryder as sort of the father, and this is the guy that was the Pathfinder. We've already introduced Sam. Now, I think that it'd be good to go through some of the characters and talk about that, because one of the biggest things about the original Mass Effect trilogy was the characters. Arguably the biggest thing, possibly.
I think that's BioWare's probably one of their biggest like selling points, is just the way that they write characters seamlessly into your story, and you almost like them as much as the character that you've created for yourself as the main character. It's as much their journey as it is yours, so it's definitely an important part.
I agree, and they make you care about them as if they were real, and like for example the suicide mission in Mass Effect 2. I mean, I don't know how many times I played through Mass Effect 2, but the amount of times I've like looked up to go, how the hell am I going to keep everyone alive? Because I couldn't, from a story perspective, it would make sense if some of them die, right? But like, I just didn't want that to happen because they were like, these were my real buddies. So look, with that in mind, I just want to have a quick talk through some of the characters, but I want to start with Ryder, as in the Ryder that you choose, whether you choose the male Ryder, the female Ryder, however you make him look. And by the way, this is another thing. So Shepard you choose male or female, there is like a base model that you can use, and then you can, or you can make them look like your own. And I always tend to just use the base model because graphically it looks the best. It's a standout like mold. Whereas with Ryder, you don't have that. A bit like Dragon Age Inquisition, they took that away. There's no base model anymore. It's just this is who, this is your person, right? I think that Ryder is a Mary Sue. That's what I think. And for those of you that maybe aren't familiar with the concept of Mary Sue, it's essentially like a fan written insert, but that was what it originally was. Like this perfect character that can do no wrong, or even if they do technically do wrong, everyone in the universe around them still loves them anyway. They just are, potentially they can be all powerful without having any real explanation. Now, so I don't think a Ryder is a Mary Sue in the classic term of Mary Sue. I think he or she is a Mary Sue in the evolved sense of Mary Sue. This character that is just, everything happens to, it's just, okay. So I'll give you my reasoning. So I'm struggling explaining it that way. The reasons why I think Ryder's a bad character and a bit of a Mary Sue is because, number one, he wasn't actually the next pick to become Pathfinder after his father or her father. I'm going to say him because I chose a he. and it just makes sense for me to call him rather than he/she the whole time. So he wasn't actually the next choice for Pathfinder. It was technically this other character called Cora, who was like the understudy to Alec Ryder. But when Alec Ryder died, the Pathfinder duties were passed on to your Ryder. So he's instantly, like within one tutorial mission, he's pushed as like the most important person in this new galaxy. Whereas, like for example, Shepard, it took a good arc of doing shit on the Citadel. Excuse me for saying that word, but doing a good bit of stuff on the Citadel, and it was a pushback from the Council initially, and even then, after you become a Spectre, like you're not the only Spectre. There's many others. You're just the first human Spectre, and it makes sense for the story, right?
Yeah.
Then the other thing I would say is like they do sort of explain why he can do things, i.e. the SAM AI.
Yeah.
And what I would say is if you go back to like Star Wars, the recent 2 movies like with Rey, if she had the SAM AI, I would understand why she was super powerful now. That's the one thing that I would say. But it's just like this really convenient, like Sam is a perfect AI. Edie had flaws. Edie had some character flaws. She didn't get everything right. The Collectors still, boarded the ship in Mass Effect 2, and you know what I mean? She still wasn't perfect, but Sam seems to be perfect. Can translate anything, can do anything, and actually becomes a big part of the story where the Archon, who is the leader of the Ket that we know of, actually discovers the SAM AI and wants to use it. That's the main plot.
Yeah, like device. It's that good. It's that good that the main enemy 500 years in the future from when, like, or however long it took them to go from our galaxy, the Milky Way, to the Andromeda galaxy, however long it took them. After all that much time, they still haven't gotten anything, of a similar level in the Andromeda galaxy yet. This SAM node is perfect. It's insane. Like it can do anything. Yeah. Like even Edie trying to tap into the Collectors, like into their system on on their ship when it was deactivated. Yeah, it took ages, and she almost failed because it's an AI, but it's not perfect. Like it still has a processing speed and all that, so it's somewhat believable. But Sam is like, it's just perfect basically.
So I mean, they could easily. I mean, they could try and find a way to explain this if they were to release more titles. I.e., yes, it was 500 years in the future, but Sam AI has not been sleeping like the humans have for those 500 years. They're spending 500 years to develop itself. I guess. I mean, that still wouldn't explain how we could then translate this completely foreign language. Like, I don't understand that. But I mean, look, moving on from that, even like as soon as you become Pathfinder, you basically get this respect straight away. It's this convenient thing where no other Pathfinders basically have shown up in the game. Like the other arcs are missing for whatever reason. Of course they are, and yet somehow they've still started setting up. This it's kind of like Citadel Part 2, really. I can't remember what it's called now, but it's the main station where
like the Hyperion or something. No,
the Hyperion is the human arc.
It's the
oh man,
I can't think of the name right now. But yeah,
it's just for the sake of this video. I mean, for me, it's just Citadel Light. A Citadel, Diet Citadel. It's not the Citadel, but it basically is trying to be. And they kind of try and set up some politics that aren't there. So they kind of have this, like, it's almost like council members for each species, or trying to be again. They have a Solarian as like essentially president. Let's put it that way. Don't know. That's what it is.
Yeah, there's no better word for it. Just president. Just like
that's what it is.
Supreme leader.
Yeah, Supreme Overlord. Yeah.
Yeah.
And basically, then you start to gradually meet these characters that become part of your team. So the first one that you really like, the first 2 that you come across, obviously you come across Cora very early on. And do you have anything that you want to say on Cora? Because I've got a lot that I want to say.
I have a few things that I'll just sort of start with. So she's actually one of the most disappointing characters for me. For a few reasons. So the first one is there could have been a very interesting, I guess, dynamic with her character and the rider that you've picked, because you basically took her job, right? And she'd been training for the position of Pathfinder, the whole time. She was the one who was selected to be the next one, and then you just kind of take it after one mission, like for no reason. And it would have been a very interesting dynamic to have a squad mate who isn't disloyal, but isn't, they still hold a bit of a grudge, right? I would have found that quite interesting if her sort of character arc would be becoming, getting over the fact and sort of, becoming a friend of yours by the end. But it kind of happens within less than a couple of missions. She's just like, okay, yeah, we're friends again, and you can romance me now too. like, oh, okay, that was quick.
Bang, okay, exactly.
So I found that quite disappointing, because I thought they would build that as a character who's, basically your second in command, because your sister or brother, the other rider, is kind of in their little cryo sleep after the ship went down or whatever. But they didn't really build on that, and that was quite disappointing. But the second most disappointing thing was her last name is Harper, which at the time I didn't pick up on it straight away, but a lot of people did. It's the same name as the Elusive Man's last name. What's his name? Jack Harper. Yeah. So
that's something you pick up from some of the fan fiction or the extended universe, because of other worlds that use that, but basically extended universe of Mass Effect. So you can find out there's a couple of books and comic strips set in the First Contact War, and basically Jack Harper was against basically up against Saren when Saren was a young Spectre. So there's some cool backstory there, and it's one of those things where it's like Chekhov's gun. Once you start, once you looked into that, that's a potential twist that they could do, and yeah. Go on. So what you were saying?
Yeah, so I found it very disappointing, because as you said, it is kind of a Chekhov's gun. They sort of lay these intricate backstories in, but then I guess they never finished it. It's like they started the thread and then they just cut it. There was nothing at the end. There was no payoff. There was nothing. There was no reason for the fans to get excited. Everybody was sort of trying to figure it out, and then there's just nothing at the end. And I find that kind of it's disappointing for me, but I think a lot of people find it almost insulting, because it's kind of like, it's kind of like rewarding the diehard fans for noticing that she's, her last name's Harper, she might be related to the Elusive Man, but then never actually giving them the payoff that they deserve for looking into it and trying to find out, for actually enjoying the game and trying to figure out what's happening. And I sort of agree. It is kind of insulting and disappointing.
You could easily say that this is going to be a reveal that they would have done in a subsequent title.
Yeah.
I'm still not convinced, because of the other things that we can get to. But my initial thought on Cora, looking at the hairstyle, and everything else, is I thought, here's our sort of diversity character. That was my first thought. Yeah. I have to say, in the end, she was probably as my top two favorite squad mates on this particular game. In the end, just because, for example, you had the fact that she lived as an Asari huntress. Which was
I think that's cool as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that was quite a cool thing, and I thought that. That mission where basically she finds out that the Asari Ark is somewhere, and then you go on this particular mission and you come across it. That was probably the best side mission on the whole game. I thought.
Yeah.
Again.
Well, I think she had a lot of backstory that could have been really cool, and I do agree that it's quite cool that she's sort of a human with Asari level training in biotics and such.
Yes.
Which is kind of awesome. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah. So my initial thought was that she would be this diversity character, Mary Sue, because she's the second in line, even though she looks about the same age as you anyway. But then I think the way they did it wasn't so bad, and as I said, Ryder turns out to be the Mary Sue. But I wasn't. If this was my second favorite character, that's already quite a low bar. So let's go through the squad mates quickly then. So the next character that you're introduced to is Liam, who is another diversity character, should we say?
Yeah.
He's a black dude with a British accent, or it sounds British to me, and so he's there right from the start. I mean, I don't know what to say about him. I just found this is not again about him. It's just he's incredibly boring. I just found him incredibly boring. Like nothing really interesting to offer. To me, there was no fantastic backstory. There wasn't I don't know.
Off the top of my head, from what I remember, his backstory was literally just like he was sort of I guess like riot control or something, like a security guard sort of backstory, and that's it. Like that's his entire qualification. That's it.
Yeah.
So I don't know how far you can go with that, but there's really nothing jumping out at me there.
Yeah. I mean, my thoughts on him is two, like, number one, Token Black, and Jacob number two, kind of.
Yeah, and Jacob wasn't very good, so a number two is,
so this is the second guy that you introduced to, and I often think that when you meet when you meet characters near the start, often they're not always fun. I mean, look at Mass Effect 2. Jacob is the first one. Then you get Miranda, although Miranda's not that bad, depending on where you're from or what your thoughts are. But generally speaking, they're not always like the best squad mates. Even looking at the first Mass Effect game, like Caden, who I think is arguably the most boring of all the squad mates in all of the games.
Yeah.
That's just my opinion. He is just very and I just found him. I just find that often the first ones you meet are not always going to be the ones that you keep on your team later on in the game. Liam. I'm just trying to look into the backstory here. I'm just clicking through. I'm on Mass Effect Wiki. He's the crisis response specialist on the human Pathfinders. Right. So his primary residence was split between London and the Citadel. Liam entered the University for Engineering, but left to train for law enforcement. So what are they doing? They're saying this guy's smart, but then decided that that's not what he felt he wanted to do. I don't understand. Either way, I found him just very boring. The next one that we acquire, or I don't know exactly the order. I think there's three that we essentially acquire in the same space of time. So we get Nakmor Drak, who is the Krogan squad member.
Yeah.
Probably the best squad member, as Krogans tend to be, in my opinion.
I agree. I think it was quite a unique take to make him kind of a more elder Krogan. So because the last two we've had were sort of Grunt, who was, I guess, technically 0 years old when you first meet him because he'd just been born out of his tank. But for example, Rex, when you first meet him, he's old for human standards. He's probably 200, 300 years old, but he's not old for Krogan standards.
Whereas this geezer's old by Krogan standards.
He's old by Krogan standards, so yeah, he's 800 or something. He's very old. And I thought that was a cool and unique take on a Krogan squad member. And I'd agree, he's definitely my favorite squad member.
I like him. There's a really good scene where you can have a bar fight with him. Which is really cool. So then on the same mission, you can pick up probably my third, Veteran Nyx, a female Turian. And this is one of those ones where, again, it could be a little bit diversity in terms of he's a female, but actually I thought she was pretty interesting as well.
I think it works really well.
Yeah. Sorry, she's the cousin or sister, I think, of someone that you come across on the Omega DLC on Mass Effect 3, where you take back Omega with Aria, so Sidera Nyx, who's the head of a really cool sort of mercenary band. And so there's a good little bit of stuff going on there. And she's a potential romance. Not sure how that would work, but there you go. But no, I thought she was all right. Next comes probably my second least favorite, if not joint least favorite of all the characters, which is PB. I'm normally a fan of the Asari squad members because it's good to have a really good biotic on there, and they're always good for a good romance. But this one just, I just hated her. First of all, PB. What kind of a name is PB?
Yeah, that must have been self-given, right? Because she's
it says her full name is Pelisaria Basale, so PB. Yeah, sorry, just stick to Pelessaria, you know.
Yeah.
But like, so she's just like this adventurer, rogue sort of loner type that just wants to go out and do her own thing. When this is okay, so there's a bit of a stupid bit of story here. So we meet her on Eos, which is before we've like terraformed essentially this planet, because that's basically what this game's all about, is finding these vaults of technology that have somehow made these planets uninhabitable, and we can just reverse that somehow. So we meet her basically out in the wild, and we haven't terraformed the planet yet. How the hell is she surviving when we go out
Don't
there?
know.
Our
Yeah.
health goes down because it's uninhabitable. How's
But
she
she's
out there
fine.
just doing her
Yeah.
thing?
Yeah. No idea.
So I'm not a big fan of her. I found her just childish, to be honest. I know she's a young Asari, and that's part of it, but I didn't like it. And the final squad member, so it's not a big squad, is Jarl, who is an Angaran, which is the new species that we're introduced to. Not sure. What do you think?
Um, if I'm honest, I feel like their whole sort of like race was basically just created as I guess like a counterbalance to the Ket, but also they're just kind of like a fanfic like race. They're not really, they're just kind of like space cat people basically. They're not. there's nothing.
Yeah,
There's nothing to them. There's no real substance, and I don't know. I didn't really like them at all. I feel like they were just written in
me too.
for the sake of it.
Yeah, I think they're stupid. I think it's a stupid race. Doesn't make sense. Don't like it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't like them. So okay, so that's the squad. In terms of like side characters and other things, I think there's another bunch of like characters that I didn't enjoy. Like there's the granddaughter of Nakmor, who is like the Krogan essentially council member. And she's interesting. The Solarian president. And a few others
Yeah.
here and there. Like there's like a Turian general. There's always a Turian general in Mass Effect games, but there's like a Turian general dude, and he's okay, but yeah, nothing special, nothing like the original trilogy. I think in terms of like really well worked characters.
Yeah, well, I think out of the squad members, Vetra and Drak are like the two sort of just most unique characters. But even then, it's mainly just unique in terms of them being a spin on already established characters, I guess. Like it's just sort of like this one's an older Krogan instead of a younger Krogan, and this one's a female Turian instead of a male Turian. But overall,
Yeah,
the difference is negligible.
I mean, look, if they did like a Mass Effect 4 still set in Mooku Way, and you had um, Drac as your squad mate with say Shepard or whatever, like I still think it would have been a really good squad mate. Everyone would have loved him. I think if we'd have met Vetra as on one of the side missions or whatever in a Mass Effect game with Shepard as well, I think we'd have gone, yeah, that's a cool side character. But I think this is the whole point, is that they've hinged this new essentially series on these characters that are just not very likable in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. I think we maybe done the characters enough. Like, let's talk a little bit about the game.
Yeah, I think we can talk infinitely about the characters, and I think it's probably easier to just move on.
So how did you find the gameplay? I mean, I'm talking about combat, general moving around, interacting with things. How did you find it all?
Okay, so I mean, the first thing I'll touch on is combat. I think it's good. I'm happy for them to move away from sort of like just the constantly looking for cover, like you would in Mass Effect, 1 through 3.
Two and three, really, because one didn't have.
Yeah,
well, it did, but it wasn't.
It did,
very
but
good.
yeah, it wasn't very good. But yeah, there's still a cover system, but it's a lot more freeform. So I think it was good to move in that direction. I kind of like the ability to sort of move vertically as well, like with the jump pack and whatnot. I don't mind it. I don't think it's fantastic, but it's there.
Yeah.
I think the main problem I have with the combat is the sort of ability system. At first I thought it was really good because you basically have the ability to free switch between whatever abilities you want. You can set up these I think they're called profiles with the SAM node, and basically you can switch between them. So you can have like a tech profile, a soldier profile, a biotic profile, and you can just switch between them at will. And at first I thought it was cool, but then I realized that's bullshit. That's ridiculous. It basically removes any semblance of a class system, and makes it so that you're a god. Your character's a god, and that sort of goes back to the Mary Sue system that you're talking about. But yeah, it sort of makes it so that, you know, how can you expect an enemy to reasonably counter your character? Like, you're not the underdog. You're literally a god. Like, you're perfect. You have an AI that can calculate everything for you instantly, and then you can swap between any abilities you need on the fly in any situation. I really don't like it. I think it sort of makes it so that you don't have to think about what abilities you get. You can just spec into everything, and you get everything basically. And I don't like it.
Exactly.
But in terms of the movement and the general combat, I think it's definitely a step up that was needed to sort of compete with combat on the likes of like Witcher 3, the Assassin's Creed games even. It just has to feel a bit smoother, I think.
I don't think that combat-wise you have to compete with Witcher 3 or Assassin's Creed because of the nature of the weapons that you're using. I think that the games that you're competing with in terms of combat on those are more like your Uncharted's, your like Red Dead Redemption and GTA's, your possibly you can step even into a first-person shooters like your Halos and stuff, because it's obviously more sort of firearm and gun oriented.
Yeah.
So I think those are the ones that you really need to look at. But I agree. I kind of liked first playthrough. I liked the jumping and booster pack sort of system. But the second playthrough, I didn't like it, and I'll tell you why. For me, the cover system, there's a reason why cover system is good. I think there's something to be said for pacing of combat as well that way. You know, you say trying to advance through a building, you get to a bit where there's a few guys, you take cover, you take them out when you can. There's some tactics. Whereas here, you're sort of jumping up and you're just hanging in the air, and you can get shot at any given time. Like there's no, even when you do want to take cover, you can't really take good cover. I found, because obviously the AI is then set to try and counteract you being able to do that. So I liked it the first time round because it was new and different, but I didn't like it second time round. And so I haven't played the Anthem full game, but I played the demo, and it feels exactly like combat is almost exactly the same as at Mass Effect Andromeda. And it got me thinking, was Andromeda's combat basically just a pre-tester for this?
I think you're probably right.
So that's something. I quite liked the, what's it called in this one? I mean, it's not called the Mako, but it's basically the Mako.
It's not the Hammerhead, it's the, I can't remember what it's called, but yeah.
So I was actually playing through it earlier just before we started recording, and I was actually using it on Eladen, which is like the desert world. And that world is one of my least favorite in general. I mean, I find them all a little bit boring. There's the typical desert world, snow world, whatever. One of the things that I don't like about this, okay, so whatever it is, Mako Part 2, let's call it for now. When you're going to so first of all, I'm going to start now. The map is not good. The sort of navigation system, I think, is not good. So you've got this map, and you can set your point. But unlike on, say, Mass Effect 2, for me, had it the best, because you'd click in the right stick, or if you're playing it on console, and it would have like an arrow that would tell you what direction to go. Now, I liked that. And because this is more open plan or open world, you have this like whatever it is at the top, and when you turn around as a 360, it will then say here's the dot, and so you can actually quite easily get lost and find yourself going completely in the wrong direction without realizing it. And it's such a big world, it's so frustrating trying to get back on track. And then to add on to that, when you've got hills and mountains and you're using the Mako Part 2,
the Nomad is what I just searched it up. It's called the Nomad.
The Nomad, that's right.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's called the Nomad. When you use the Nomad and you're going up a hill, you're going fine, and then all of a sudden, bang! It can't actually make it up the rest of the hill.
Yeah.
and you then get stuck falling backwards for ages because you can't turn the wheel sideways and not fall backwards somehow. It's just really frustrating. I found it really frustrating navigation on this.
Yeah, you might actually see in the background gameplay that happened to me whilst I was exploring this planet in the Nomad. The marker would show like, oh yeah, it's just over this hill. So I'd be like, okay, easy enough. I'll follow this sort of trail looking thing up the hill, and you just reach a point where it's like, nah, can't go up there. It's too high up.
And this is actually quite a big point, I think, in terms of a wider game aspect. I mean, and look, let's talk about this briefly now. I think this is actually quite an interesting point. I think there's a lot of different map and navigation systems in games. Like you look at like The Witcher, you can set a point and it has like dotted lines on the map for you where to go. Same you can set with like a Red Dead or a GTA. Same with a lot of games actually. So it makes it easier to follow a trail. Now, a lot of gamers will complain about this, saying, no, I want to just explore and, ask questions and follow signs in the game to find it. And fine, I'm well in with that. And I think that there are times and places where you can do that. So let's say it's the destination that your character hasn't been to before. There's no maps really available. So it makes sense that if you haven't been there, maybe there's no straight directions. You have to sort of find your way. But when there is directions, or when you don't want to be just messing around for hours and hours just to find the place that you need to go, I think you should have an option in game to be able to have it much clearer than that. That's my thing.
Yeah.
And I think that Mass Effect, or Andromeda tries to. I want to stop calling it Mass Effect actually, and I'll tell you why later. But I think Andromeda tries to make it so that it's a bit more of an exploration, because obviously it is a new galaxy and I get that. I just don't want to spend 30 minutes trying to find where I got to go and then have 2 minutes of doing what I need to do there. I want to have 2 minutes of finding it and 30 minutes of doing what I need to do there. That's the way I want it to be. But that's my personal take.
Well, I sort of agree. I feel like the exploration, the problem with it is it's not free roam exploration in the way that you'd want it to be. So it'll chuck the marker somewhere on the map, but there's really only one way you can get to it. You'll try to go over a mountain or a hill or whatever, and that's not the way it wants you to go into it. So you can't go that way. If you try to go around the other side of the mountain, that'll be the edge of the map. So no, can't go that way. You have to, like, it's still on rails. It just looks like it's free roam, and that kind of, it kind of ruins the whole illusion of this exploration that they're trying to build.
Agreed.
And it's made even worse by the fact that it's kind of the majority of the game is that exploration part rather than the doing what you need to do once you get there part. And it just doesn't really work properly. Yeah,
agreed. So throughout the game, you have these different sort of puzzles to complete as you try to go in through like these vaults to terraform planets essentially, and at other moments too. And it's all like some of the puzzles are essentially like Sudokus, where you've got to match the shapes and not have them doubled up and stuff. And now I'm one of these people that I'm not a massive fan of Sudoku, personally. That's just not the way I work, and so I didn't like these puzzles at all. This is just my personal thing. I see why they put them in, but like if we go back to the Mass Effect 2, they sort of had two different versions. They had these hacking and what was the other one? There was hacking, and then there was like it's like rewiring almost, or whatever, bypass. That's it, bypassing.
Yeah.
And they made sense, like you just matching up sort of the lines of code in the hacking, and then with the bypass, you like essentially it's playing pair, where you pair up, the same sort of things, but it's only like I think 4 pairs overall. Whereas this one is just, to me, it's just a bit of a slog. I didn't like it. I'm not good at them anyway, so I didn't like that aspect of it.
Well, it's also, you have this super intelligent AI in your head. Why don't you just plug him in and have him quickly solve it in like 2 seconds? Why do I have to manually solve it as a human? Like,
exactly.
I have an AI for a reason. At least let me use it.
Yeah, and are my squad mates not gonna be there giving me pointers as well? Are they dumb too? Like,
yeah. Like,
what's the point in them? Because as we all know, in most Mass Effect games, the squad mates don't generally kill many of the enemies anyway. So it's not like they're killing people for you. And that's the other thing I've noticed. So when you get it wrong, oftentimes when you're at these monoliths, which you've got to like activate before you can go into these vaults. Like if you get the thing wrong, then these like flying robots basically with lasers appear to like shoot you, and you've got to kill them before you get another chance. Now I've got 2 squad mates with me. Is there any chance that these squad mates could just keep them off my back whilst I carry on?
Solve it, yeah.
You know, there's so many little things with that. I'm not a massive fan. The customizability of his outfit and stuff, still pretty on point. I think as far as what you could do with Shepard stuff, it's pretty similar. I actually liked the outfits. I thought they looked fine. Instead of being generally that darker color, like black and red, it's more like
them were quite white and blue. Blues. Yeah.
So that's fine. I'm fine with that. Let's talk about this. The Tempest.
Yeah, that's a big one. So I think it's a complete step down from the Normandy in every single way. Like, to summarize it very quickly,
it's supposed to be faster even than the Normandy. But I didn't like the design. I didn't like the layout. I didn't like the fact that we had to like manually climb up a ladder to get between the levels often. There's just things that I didn't like about it. The characters on the Tempest, the Doctor, the Cesari, voiced by probably the biggest name actress or actor in this game, who's I think Natalie Dormer. She's in Game of Thrones and Hunger Games and other things. She's just like, she's not as good as Dr. Chak was. She's not that interesting to talk to. The pilots, or whatever navigators, there's like a Solarian, and then there's like some Scottish Indian bird. I just didn't find them intriguing. It's not like Joker. Even Joker is like an amazing character, and perfectly voiced by Seth Green. We just didn't have that. Like, if these pilots died in the course of this game, I genuinely wouldn't have cared.
Yeah. Well, it was sort of like, you've got a lot to live up to with not just the squad mates of the previous games, but all the supporting characters, Dr. Chakwas, Joker, all that. And they don't really live up to any of them. It's like the side characters are really noticeably side characters in this, whereas, in the original trilogy, Joker, for example, is just as much a squad mate as everyone else. Like, just because he doesn't come down to the missions with you, he's literally carrying you by
and yet one of the best missions in the whole trilogy, you are Joker.
Yeah, you play as him because he was very important.
So, I mean, this is the thing though, when you don't have great sort of primary characters, how can we expect the secondary characters to be good either? And I think again some of them are quite lazily written, and I guess so. The Tempest itself, it was definitely no Normandy. It's not terrible. It's just not. It's not what you come to expect when you're playing through what should be a Mass Effect game. I want to touch on this whilst we're sort of here. I've got a question for you. I mean, let's talk about like this whole inclusive/diversity push that's going on in creative media at the moment. There seems to be a bit of an agenda, and this is obviously not a politics show, but do we think that this did have an effect on the storytelling and the characters of this game?
Yeah, definitely. I think I don't want to say they had a quota to meet as such, but I definitely say that they actively attempted to sort of conform to what would be expected in current modern media in that way, by adding a lot of characters that maybe wouldn't have made it into older games, or wouldn't have been written in such a way in older games, specifically to, I guess, appease a large proportion of their fan base. And while normally it wouldn't really bother me, it's definitely becoming more and more common, not just in games, but movies and such, and it becomes more and more noticeable as it becomes more apparent.
So about 3 weeks or 2 weeks after the release of the game, BioWare apologized for Mass Effect Andromeda's poor transgender representation and called it an unfortunate byproduct of the iterative process of game design. Why, when you're making a game, do you have to think about transgender representation? Because as soon as you're thinking about that, I think that takes away from what you're actually then writing. You know, I think it's
Yeah.
fine if there are transgenders in there, for me, if it adds to the story, if it makes for the story. But if you're just doing it because you have to hit, you have to represent everyone, then I think that straight away is going to mean that you're not writing a good story.
Yeah.
And something else to mention whilst we're here, there was a guy who was one of the lead writers for this game. He wasn't on the previous games, and he, by the looks of it, won't be on the following games. But a guy called Manveer Air or Hare or Hire or whatever is the pronunciation of that name, but Manveer, whose basically Twitter like page is full of him tweeting out stuff like, um, like I love to see white people suffer and just all kinds of shit like that. Now again, I'm not going to be talking about this from oh my god, like I'm a white dude, how dare he? That is racist. Like it's racist.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and I
and
think if you have a force like that driving the production of a game, of course, there's gonna be some questionable choices in the writing, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And then you've obviously got the same people that as soon as Mass Effect fans who have been fans, like going into the Andromeda's release is almost 10 years after the first game came out. I mean, Mass Effect fans and BioWare fans are pretty much synonymous, mostly.
Yeah.
And so being a fan of BioWare, if you've been with them from the start, you're talking about close to 20 years of being a BioWare fan. And then to say I'm a bit worried about potentially an agenda in this game, especially when you've got someone like Manveer being the main writer and getting away with all that kind of stuff. And then to have people come out, for example, Mike.com, when they came out of an argument and just said, Mass Effect Andromeda conspiracy theorists show that Gamergate is as alive as ever, basically just trying to write it off as like racist criticism, like, oh, it's just racist white males. Like, no, it's not. It's like I don't want characters that are going to be written by a guy that hates white people, or hates anyone, to be honest with you.
Well,
Like,
yeah, I mean, and especially if it's noticeable, that's the problem. Like, if he hated white people, but it wasn't noticeable in the game, and he didn't actively talk about it, we wouldn't know. But it's the fact that he actively comes out and talks about it, and also
yeah.
it's noticeable in the games. So,
Well, I mean,
it
then
causes
on
alarm.
this, I'd say call me racist, but I think if the same dude, if he was a white man that had tweeted out that he hates black people or brown people, would obviously want to see him lose his job and not do any writing on this. And I
Yeah,
think the same standard should be applied if it's the other way around, which it
yeah,
was. And unfortunately, when he lost his job, the game was already written and released.
yeah.
So I think I think I've said all I want to say on that. I don't want to go any more into that.
Yeah.
Do you have anything that you want to add, or are you happy to
No,
move?
I feel like it's easier to just move on that. There's a lot that we could say about it, but it's
Yeah.
definitely, it sort of speaks for itself, I think.
Okay, so let's touch back onto a bit of sort of gameplay stuff. So Mass Effect or BioWare in general are known for having choices, both small choices within conversation of how to get from A to B in a conversation, but also choices that generally have far-reaching consequences for the story and the world that you're in. What did you think of the choices that you were presented with in this game?
I mean, I think the majority of them, as I sort of touched on with the whole Ket situation in the original mission, there's a lot of points where the choices just feel like they don't actually exist. Like it seems extremely obvious that they're just choices in the game rather than actual choices that affect the universe, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah.
for example, in the original trilogy, you've got a lot of choices that actually affect the next games coming up, and ultimately affect the ending of the specific games that you're playing. So, for example, Mass Effect 2, you can get a different ending depending on how well you've worked with your team and such. But I feel like in this game, the choices are just kind of almost arbitrary. They feel like they affect only the mission that you're in, and all it really affects is the how you're going to proceed for the mission. So maybe you'll go in a different door instead. That's it. Nothing really, nothing really changes. Or maybe you kill a group that you've never really heard of, and it doesn't affect anything past that point. I don't know. I just feel like most of the choices fall really flat and don't affect anything outside of the moment that they're prompted to you. What do you think, though?
Okay, so I think that first of all, I think the best choice that you have is on what I've already alluded to is probably the best mission or quest or whatever you want to call it on the whole game, which is the sort of Cora like loyalty one where you can go and find the Asari arc. And there's a bit of a twist in terms of, the Pathfinder there's a bit dodgy, blah, blah, blah. And you can either choose to alert stuff or keep the secret or whatever. And that does feel like a decent choice. And that does feel like one of those choices that will come back, in later sort of editions or whatever releases of the game. But it doesn't actually have a huge end consequence even within this game. But it's still, to me, was quite a good choice. That was a fairly Mass Effect original trilogy type of choice.
Yeah.
And the only other one is that depending on some of the choices that you make, your sister or brother, depending on which choice you make, can wake up out of this sort of coma early or not. So you can be honest with them somehow through this implant. You can basically have some psychic conversations with them even though they're in a coma, and you can sort of tell them that your dad's already died or choose not to. And that does affect what happens when they wake up. And when they wake up, it is quite a big moment for sort of the final boss mission-ish of the game. So that one is another one. But apart from that, the rest of the choices are all fairly arbitrary and the consequences are minimal at best. So I didn't think that the choices felt good. Mass Effect original trilogy, I genuinely had to put down my controller at moments and really think, and even then go onto Google and Reddit and look up what people have done and what it might mean, and to really think about what I want to do. Like letting the Arachnoid Queen go in the first and third games, you got the choice twice, the same choice essentially. The choices like that, really, what consequences they would have. The third game, one of the best choices you have is you might have to choose between the Geth or the Quarians. That by itself is fantastic, in terms of choice and really deep. So there was nothing that felt like it was on that level in this game. And that's, for me, that is a disappointment because that's what these games are supposed to be about.
Yeah, I think the problem is if you compare even relatively minor choices in the original trilogy, for example, one that I would consider is during the Zaid side mission. You basically, it's technically a minor choice, but you basically have to choose between being ultimate paragon and actually saving people or getting the loyalty of your squad member. And it's in the grand scheme of things, you lose a few maintenance workers that work for a dodgy organization anyway, so it's not a huge trade-off, but it's still a minor choice that will affect the game. If you want to be the ultimate paragon character and actually save them, you're gonna lose Zaid's loyalty, and that's just how it's a small scale issue, but it still affects the game, right up till the end. Because if not all of your squad members are loyal, you might lose some.
Well, absolutely.
Whereas in this game, I feel like minor choices affect one conversation at best, and major choices affect one mission at best. Is basically the best way to scale it.
I also think that when in conversations, so they kind of make it more clear, or try to make it more clear at times, what type of response you're giving. So there's a little picture of a heart or whatever.
Yeah.
But then sometimes it's not sure whether that heart is you're just being friendly and encouraging your squad, or you're flirting, right? So first time I had a playthrough, I was, as you do, you go around your ship talking to your team because that's how you get extra missions or romance options. And I was just having a chat with Liam, and I gave a response which I thought was a friendly, I'm your Pathfinder, but I'm giving you some encouragement. That's it response. And the response I get from Liam was, "Oh my god, I don't go that way. Sorry, dude." I'm like, no, I wasn't flirting. But I selected it by mistake. Whereas I think that it was very clear on the original trilogy if you're making those options. So from that perspective as well, choice wise, it's just weird. And I didn't think that it was, I didn't think the choices were fantastic, to be honest. I'm not big on that. In terms of all of the missions and everything, I mean, did we really any of the side missions?
I mean, for me, most of the side missions were just a chore to get done, to move on.
Yeah.
I won't lie, that's kind of how they felt to me.
Agreed.
I mean, to some extent, in a lot of games, side missions can be kind of like that. But I think it was very noticeable in this game. The side missions just weren't very memorable, and often it was just so that I could leave the area and just feel like I could move on with the maximum amount of like.
It was just
Yeah,
completionism, really, wasn't it?
yeah, yeah.
Okay. When the game ended, so the ending was, spoiler again, you sort of defeat the Archon, and I think you then get all like the rest of your humans out of cryo or something, if I remember rightly. It's been a while since I finished it, and I haven't finished it on my second playthrough yet either. So I think the ending is basically you can start the settling process. Essentially, you find a place, like you land. I think you can land the Hyperion Arc, and that's now the humans' home world, essentially new home world. And that's, it's not the worst ending for if it's the first of a trilogy, but to me, it just was like one of those ones where it was a little bit flat. I wasn't sure if I wanted more, in terms of more in this story. I mean, what did you think?
Yeah, well, I think, especially if they're trying to set up for a trilogy, it doesn't really leave you wanting any answers. It's sort of just, I mean, at least the main story, anyways, sort of just leaves you. It's sort of like, okay, that's that. Like, it's done. Like, I'm done. On my first playthrough, I got maybe 3/4 of the way through, and I was actually really burnt out by that point. And it's not even that long of a game, really, but I was so burnt out that by the time I got to the end, I wasn't like, damn, that was really interesting. Like, I want to, see what would happen if I made different choices. I was just kind of like, okay, thank God it's over, I guess. I think that kind of sucks because if they're building a trilogy or even just any kind of sequel in that same universe, there won't be any interesting questions going into it unless they, create new ones. I think in this game specifically, the most interesting part is things that I've learnt post game that I didn't even discover on my own. It's just stuff that is circulating the internet. Is like the whole like benefactor information and stuff like that is more interesting than the main story.
And there's like a little teaser about the mother, the writer mother, who was sick. We found out through the game was sick, and we thought died, but turns out was cryogenically frozen with a different name on the Hyperion. So she's there as well, but we were told not to. We found out Alec Ryder told not to release the name or whatever. So basically, we don't know that she's alive, or our character doesn't know that she's alive, but she is. So there's another little sort of teaser, and that in itself, I mean, it could be a good twist, but again, it depends how they do it, and I don't actually have the confidence that it will be done well, because again, we had this sort of Chekhov's gun of Cora's last name that wasn't acted upon now. All right, so let's maybe give it our score. Let's go through our review. And for basically, as our first review, let's sort of quickly go through the rules a little bit, I think. Basically, we're going to mark it on a few factors. We're going to go through graphics, gameplay, story, world/atmosphere. This can mean ambience and whatever. A soundtrack, I really think, is important too. Overall immersion, which is sort of a combination of all of those. And then we've got wow factor, as in how much did we go, wow, like this really wowed me. And then finally, how did it compare to expectations, i.e. pre? Now, I do think that's an important stat or figure as well. And then we basically average those scores out. It's out of 10. And we average those scores out to see what it gets overall. So I think we've both scored it. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to go through your scores for each, or we'll go through them one by one, shall we? We'll give it like ours both.
Yeah, and then we'll compare our scores at the end and just see like where we differed, I suppose.
Sounds good. Okay, so what did you give it for graphics?
So I think this is the strongest part of the game right out the gate. I think the graphics were a 9 out of 10, I'd say, especially for 2 years ago. I think they still hold up to this day very strongly. And I think it was definitely one of the most, I guess, grand parts of the game was just seeing these worlds in the way that they've portrayed them with the graphics that they have. It really makes you look at the world and be like, yep, that looks big, or that looks dark or hot, or you can really tell that like it feels alive basically thanks to the graphics. So I definitely think that's the strongest part of the game.
Agreed, and I'll actually go a slight step further. I like to give real credit where credit's due, at the same time as giving criticisms where they're due. And so for me, I gave the graphics 9.4 because I was going to give it a 9 as well. But then I looked around and I said, well, what games are better than this? And especially given that it was already a couple of years ago. And then to think, okay, so if there aren't that many games that I could objectively say are much better than this, then to me, to give it a 9.4 seems fair, because that puts it right up there as some of the best graphics games around. So, yeah. How about for the gameplay?
So overall gameplay, I think, as we sort of touched on with the combat and whatnot earlier on, I'd say the gameplay is probably 7 out of 10. It's not, it's not fantastic. It doesn't feel amazing, but it's also, there's nothing wrong with it at all. It's definitely, definitely right near the top for me. I think the combat, especially as I said earlier, was fairly smooth. And I guess you sort of disagreed with me a little bit in terms of the combat, but I actually thought that the main part of the combat I found was that you could really tackle areas in different ways. So for example, it's like the biotic spear ability or something, where basically you basically charge across the room and like hit them, hit an enemy. I thought it was really good that you could, for once anyways, you could really pick apart areas in different ways. You could go up on the top and use cover up on a higher level, or you could go down, use cover on a lower level. You could cross the whole room in a second with a biotic ability, or whatever it is that you happen to do, you can really tackle the combat in a different way. And that's why I think that the gameplay anyways was still definitely a fairly strong aspect of the game. Obviously the few things that draw it back are, especially in combat anyways, is the fact that even though you can pick apart fights in different ways, the game gives you every single one of those ways for free via the SAM profile sort of system. So you don't actually carve your own path through the combat. The game kind of gives you every single path and you just pick one, which I'm not a huge fan of. But overall, gameplay I gave 7. What about you?
Okay, I actually gave it exactly 7 as well.
Oh yeah.
I think it's solid. I think it's it is easy to do, really, and that's one of the other things. It's not like a huge learning curve to get into it, in my opinion. That first tutorial mission got me into the whole, okay, if I jump up I can then start shooting, and he sort of hovers up there for a while, and that got me through it, and then I was ready to go for the rest of the game. I too liked some of the sort of biotic additions and little things that you could do. I didn't mind that at all. That's what you want in RPGs at the end of the day. So I did like that, but I can't score it higher than 7, given that I think there are just a few bugbears still, like the map/navigation system in the Nomad, and even not in the Nomad, to be honest. I think some of the gameplay in terms of how you choose your conversation response is not always very smooth, very easy. So yeah, I have to say 7 is a solid sort of, that for me is a good/average, like just maybe a bit above average for me.
Yeah, that sounds fair enough to me.
Okay, and how about the story?
So story is where it really starts to drop for me. I give the story a 2 overall.
Okay.
It didn't really grip me at all. In fact, after the first sort of initial playthrough, during that first half where I was just sort of ignoring any issues I had with it, by the halfway mark, I was so burnt out with the story that genuinely I was questioning everything that was happening. The Archon, that dude who was sort of above the Archon, I guess. There was a higher level leader that's higher than the Archon.
Yeah.
I was just sort of everything was just kind of confusing me. None of their motives made sense. Even side missions, the motives, it just seemed like people who were supposed to be villains or not your friend were just assholes for the sake of it, to make you dislike them rather than understand them. There wasn't really any reasoning behind it. You don't sort of see their motives and be like, yeah, I disagree with it, but I understand where they're coming from. It's just, this guy's an asshole for the sake of it. Why not? Sure. Or this character does some illicit alien drugs, so that's why he's an asshole. Okay, no other reason, no motive. So yeah, I gave it a 2. What about you?
Slightly higher, but still just a 3. For me, I've sort of just tried to think about it from a perspective of does it stand alone as a game by itself? And if could I guess this is, there's an asterisk by that 3 because it's with that thing of if they release another game in that same series, which I think a lot of this game is just sequel baited, to be honest. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why I have a problem with it, because like Mass Effect 1, for example, if you only ever played that one game, that's still a pretty good story and a pretty good game by itself. Same with Mass Effect 2, for example, and actually even the same for Mass Effect 3. And I know a lot of people that have only played one game in the series, and you could easily just play it by itself and it's a good game, whereas this one feels like you have to then play whatever may or may not come down the line. So it's a little asterisk by that 3, but I've given it a 3 because it's not the worst setup in the world. It then depends on what they do next. So they probably don't deserve to get a 3 from me because of it. If it's by itself, for me, it's a 1 or a 2 because it's poor. But
yeah,
I can see that there could be a bit higher potential, but not much. And so the overall world / atmosphere, how did you go with that?
So I gave it a bit high. I gave it a 6. I don't think it's necessarily good, but I don't think it's necessarily bad either. Like, it's fairly baseline for me. I like it because I enjoy sci-fi worlds in the first place, and I think it's cool to sort of see where these people, like how these people deal with issues, but whilst they're sort of dealing with galactic level threats as well. I like seeing the planets, even if the actual exploration once you're on them kind of sucks. I still like seeing them from space and sort of being like, oh, that's a desert planet. That one might have good resources, but not so much in the way of like survivability. Like, I'll probably be taking damage or whatever it is. I think the building of the atmosphere, like sort of story wise, so like during the missions with like the Remnant, for example, it didn't really give me the same creepy vibe as like, for example, the Geth or other mechanical species would give me in the original
Agreed.
trilogy. So I think the atmosphere, especially story wise, was quite weak. But in terms of the actual universe being built, especially with the incredible graphics, sort of saves it and gives it a 6 for me.
Agreed.
What about you?
So I was ready to give it also quite a high score, but I've taken it down based on my second playthrough so far. I don't think they've crafted a very an amazing atmosphere at all, or a good world. And I think this is one of the massive drawbacks of this game and why it was so disappointing, was because in the original trilogy you had all of these planets that had their own like politics and tied in with everything very well. And when you went there, you felt like you were genuinely on them. Like when you went to Ilium on Mass Effect 2, you felt like you were on this, trading Asari world city. There's just city everywhere. Omega, you felt like you were in this slum like sort of, world. You felt like you were in these, whereas these games, they're just kind of gone, oh, let's chuck in whatever it is, whatever that their equivalent of Omega was, with like another female sort of lesbian leader. That's, here you go, bang, like let's do it. And it didn't make any sense for this to be the case. It just didn't make any sense to me. You've got New Tuchanka, which just seems like a bit of a, it's like, okay, and it's just, again, it didn't make any sense. I didn't like it. I didn't think it was that much of a good world. And I didn't have the same atmosphere as I had in Mass Effect, and so I had to give it a 2.
Yeah, I think your points are reasonable. I think for me, I was just slightly biased because I just think it's I guess it's really easy to please me with good graphics if you're showing me, big planets and that sort of thing. So that's why my score landed quite a bit higher.
And me too, but I feel like that's not enough. I mean, this for me, this category, it's about the general world and atmosphere, and we already talked about this in our top 5 favorite games list. But like, graphics are great, and showing that can be good. But for me, it's not about necessarily always being this most beautiful, let's look at what we've got. It's about also how deep is it, and I felt that this game just wasn't very deep.
That's fair enough.
Okay, how about the soundtrack, the OST?
So for this one, I can't even really state anything about it. I don't really remember any specific tracks.
Mhm.
So usually when a game's soundtrack is good or at least decent, I'll remember, you know, one or two tracks from it. Maybe they'll get stuck in my head every now and then, but you know, for the most part, it won't be crazy. Like a good soundtrack, I'll remember lots of them, and it'll give me like really good memories if I hear it. But in this game, I can't think of a single song or track that I
Mm.
have ever had stuck in my head. I can't imagine one in my head or anything like that. It didn't stick with me at all. So I would give it a 4.
Okay.
What about you?
Well, I've gone quite a bit higher. This is the second highest, I think, that score that I've given it. So I've given it an 8. Again, I can't remember, you know, individual tracks from that original playthrough, but everything seemed to fit, in my opinion. It was all like, that's actually one of the things they did quite well, I thought, was having scores and music that fit in given situations. I can't pick out a particular one as an example, but I just remember it being something that was good actually about it, in my opinion. So I've gone for an 8.
Okay, fair enough.
Overall immersion, and by this what I mean is, you know, how much were you obviously immersed, stuck into it? How much were you, you know, felt like you were a part of it, and you know, like that you were Ryder basically.
So I think for this one, I gave it a kind of high score, well, high-ish, that maybe isn't deserved as such, but it's also, I still sort of stand by it. So I gave it a 5, and it's because I wasn't completely taken out of it on my first playthrough. You know, there wasn't any moments where I was just like, okay, that's bullshit, right? There was nothing that completely threw me off the characters, but there was nothing that made me think, wow, like this is a universe that like I could really see existing. There was nothing that was like, wow, like I really feel like I'm in Ryder's shoes. Like what would I do in this situation? There wasn't really any moments like that. It was just kind of like, you know, I never really stepped out of the bounds of, yeah, this is a game. There was nothing there was nothing special to hook me in, and there was nothing too crazy to boot me out. So I put it with a baseline of 5.
Yeah. Look, I sort of agree with you. I give it slightly higher. I'll give it a 6. Again, first playthrough wise, I did feel immersed. I don't know if that was partly because I wanted to be, because I wanted to, you know, especially first playthrough, I went going through it with, you know, quite high expectations. I also giving it like a lot of leniency because it was Mass Effect, and I wanted to give it a chance to really breathe. And so I was immersed in it in my first playthrough. I did enjoy a lot of the stuff in the first playthrough, but again, now tempered that with the second playthrough and the fact that it didn't seem to go anywhere, I can't give it higher than a 6. But I do think that I was immersed the first time round. I did feel like I was Ryder, and I did want to get into it, so that's why I think a 6. Like you, I think maybe it could be generous, but that's what I'm going to give it. And we want to talk about the one that is really hard to be objective about. It's the very subjective, probably the most subjective, this one and the next one, the most subjective of all of our sort of scores or whatever. Wow factor.
Okay, so for me on this one, you know, when I first played through it, I was, as I said multiple times now, I was sort of blinded. But having played it again, and sort of during that second half of my first playthrough, Eva, as well, rather, I wasn't really, you know, I wasn't really wowed by anything. There was no points where I was like, wow, that's a really key or pivotal choice. There was nothing that I sort of looked at and was like, wow, that really sort of stacks up against other games and makes me think that this is, you know, one of my favorites. Nothing special really happened. It was a very straight line sort of story. So my wow factor score out of 10 would be 2.
Yeah.
There are a few, you know, very, very small, like minor, like parts in side quests maybe where you'd be like, oh, that's an interesting mission, or that's a cool character arc. But there was nothing even in the main story that I was really like, wow, that wowed me.
Yeah.
What about you?
Look, even in the first playthrough, my wow factor was quite low. Yes, I was immersed. Yes, I was trying to enjoy it, but I was never wowed by anything. It was never like, like for example, there's scenes in all of the original trilogy where you just go, oh my God, wow. Like,
Yeah.
this, especially like I'm thinking the scenes in say Mass Effect 3 where like, okay, so Mass Effect 3 in my opinion is my least favorite of the original trilogy, for reasons that we'll talk about another time. But like there are scenes where like you go one on one with like a Reaper staring at it in its face, and you've got like the whole quarry and sort of like fleet targeting it to shoot it when you tell it to, and it's like wow, that's a wow moment. Like the moment where like you're trying to cure the genophage and there's a Reaper there as well, that's kind of wow. There's a few other bits and bobs even in that game that are wow, even though that was one of my, what I thought was one of the weakest. There was no moments in this where I thought, wow. Like even what they thought was their wow, which is when you go onto Aya, which is the home world of the Angara, this new species. Like it's supposed to be this beautiful world, but I wasn't wow at all. Like I just didn't. It was just like okay. So I've given it a 2 as well.
Yeah.
I just wasn't particularly, even from the first playthrough. Like I enjoyed it on the first playthrough, kinda, but I wasn't wowed.
Yeah, well, I think even comparing it to like the opening scenes of some of the previous games in the franchise, for example, Mass Effect 3, again, like my least favorite of the original trilogy. The opening scenes for that is like, wow, the Reapers are literally, they're on Earth. Like this
Yep.
is our home. This is our home world where you'll be sitting to play the game. You're like, shit, dude. Like, what would I do if there were Reapers attacking the Earth? Like,
Yeah.
Whereas the intro sequence to this game is just you're sort of your ship is sort of I guess attacked by this unknown sort of substance in space, and then you find out that like this homeworld that you've been, well, not homeworld, but this planet that you want to consider as the new homeworld in the Andromeda galaxy is non-inhabitable. So it's like, okay, like okay, cool, like let's
Which
move
we
on.
could have known, we could have predicted that from even before,
Yeah.
So on that as well, okay, so how this is the final like factor that we got to take into account is
Yep.
how did it compare to our expectations? And by that I mean, all of the hype beforehand, having played previous Mass Effect and BioWare games, what we thought for this game would be, what would you give it out of 10?
This one is my worst score by far, and that's because I have quite a heavy bias having played the original trilogy like many times through, read some of the comics, watched the like little animated movie.
Yeah.
So I consider myself a huge fan of both Mass Effect and BioWare, and so coming into this game, I was really expecting a really sort of epic start to a new trilogy, and even on that first playthrough, it really didn't stack up to anything of the first trilogy, or even games that BioWare have created in the past, like the Knights of the Old Republic games, or whatever you want to reference. It just didn't stack up to what BioWare have achieved in the past. So for me, this is a 1 on my score.
Yeah, I agree. Mine's at 1 as well for basically the exact same reasons. We'd waited 5 years for a new Mass Effect game. We'd been promised that it was going to be this amazing world. They'd gone to Andromeda instead of the Milky Way, and I was kind of behind that when I heard them talk about it. And I liken this release to a little bit to like Fable 2, where like I felt like we were promised so much, like Peter Molyneux famously did, and then what actually got delivered was not the worst thing in the world, but there was no way it was ever going to stack up to what they promised. Yeah. So I would give it a 1 as well. And I think that when we look at like the original, so this is probably the hardest category for sequels or whatever to ever really score well in. If like, for example, if we're talking about a game that is the first of its kind, expectations are going to not always be that high anyway, so that the chances of it scoring highly are going to be higher, right? But when we're talking about a game that's the 4th in a series and the however many in a series by a particular developer that is a very good track record, not going to do well by its very nature compared to expectations, because expectations for this would have been like 10, right? We were expecting like an 8 or a 9 or a 10 out of 10. So as soon as it doesn't hit that, it's going to be hard for it. So I understand that this particular category is going to be the hardest one for games of this type to ever score well in. But I tried to take that into account with my answer. I wanted to give like a 5, right? But I can't, because this was not good enough. And the characters weren't good enough and everything that we've already said. So I can't give it any more than a 1.
Yeah, well, I think for me, it's even worse than just being slightly disappointed. It's actually what we got was objectively worse than everything in the original trilogy. Basically, it wasn't.
Agreed.
It didn't stack up in any specific category, and that's my problem. If it was just slightly disappointing, like if I expected an 8 or a 9 or a 10 out of 10 and I got a 7, this score would still, this score wouldn't drop it quite as low as it is. But I was genuinely like I factored it into my response to this part.
I agree.
And it wasn't just that it was slightly disappointing. It was genuinely a not very good game that we got.
I agree.
Rather than just a not very good BioWare or Mass Effect game, it was just a not very good game, and that's why this scored so low for me.
So we've got our categories.
Yep.
If we average that out, what score would you give it overall then? With an average?
So mine averaged out is a 4.5 out of 10.
Yep.
So, and I think that works quite well. That's a fairly rounded number for me. It's not, it's not on the middle line. It's not good. It's just, and it's not awful. It's just, just below that middle line. It's like a C grade. It's quite, it's poor basically is the best description I'd give for that.
Yeah.
What about you? What's your average?
Yeah, so mine is actually 4.8, so very slightly higher than yours. Quite a bit closer to that psychological mark of 5 out of 10. Now, I just want to say that giving a score of 5 out of 10 doesn't mean something's a bad game. We're not IGN, for example, or somebody else that gives out 9s and 10s like they're going out of fashion. So scoring a 5 means that you're hitting average. That it's a good game. It's not bad, but it's nothing amazingly special, basically.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was trying to explain. It's not like a 5 isn't a bad score. It's just
that's right.
Very very average score. Yeah,
that's right. It's just not a particularly good score, and I think getting a 4.8 for me also feels quite fair. Obviously, if you look at the categories that I gave it, I mean, this is where I think graphics, gameplay, immersion, and I guess soundtrack, it scored very well in. So that means that it did some things well. But where it let itself down was the general storyline, the general world and atmosphere, and it didn't wow me or live up to expectations. And I think that's where it comes down. And I think that's probably fair as well. I think a 4.8 is not the end of the world for it. Again, that's something they could come back from if they wanted to release an Andromeda 2, for example, and do it better. Bring back good writing, for example. So I don't think 4.8 is going to kill should kill the franchise in itself. But yeah, I think that is way below par for what they should have done.
I think it's as a whole the game is just below average. It's not completely brought down by the fact that our expectations were high and the delivery was low. Like it's genuinely just when stacked up to the average of games, it's below it basically.
Yeah. I mean, I already sort of tried to unpick a little bit on what our categories were, and I know, like as I said, I mentioned the compared to expectations is always going to be a tough one to score well in for a game like this, because expectations would be very high going into it. I'm thinking about, for example, a game like Cyberpunk 2077 when that comes out. That's going to be an interesting one compared to expectations, because in a way, expectations are already high because obviously CD Projekt Red, for example. But at the same time, expectations are low because they've never made this kind of game before. They've only ever made the Witcher games. We don't know what the story is going to be. So we actually don't know enough about it, even now, to really have, so it's kind of going to be one of those ones where, yes, expectations are high, but at the same time, specific parts of that expectations are going to be very low. So that kind of a game might be able to score like an 8 compared to expectations much more easily than this one.
Yeah.
So I am aware of that, and that is quite tough, but that comes with the territory, right? That I think that does come with the reviews. There's a reason why, for example, The Empire Strikes Back is the highest rated Star Wars movie, even though it's the second ever made, rather than the first. That's because expectations were high, but they not only did they hit them, but they smashed them out of the ballpark, even compared to the Star Wars that have been coming out since. So,
Yeah.
there's a reason for that. Well, I guess we should make like our, lawyer speak, like some closing arguments, I think here, or closing statements. If you don't mind, I'll like go first on this. I've got a couple of things that I want to say that we haven't sort of brought up. So I think one of the things that for me brings this game down is the fact that they didn't actually address the monstrosity and awfulness that was the ending of Mass Effect 3. I think that they wanted to avoid that altogether, and that was what drove them to go to Andromeda as the nearest galaxy, as opposed to a good storyline reason. And I think that they worked the backwards from the wrong way. They kind of went, we needed to go to Andromeda. Okay, what makes sense? How can we do that? Rather than having an end goal and working backwards from a story, which is what you're supposed to do. So I can understand why they did that, but I think that it was weak. It was kind of cowardly in a way to do that and not just address that ending and try and retcon or create, or canonize a particular ending. And this isn't a plug particularly, but our next 3 videos are going to be our creative take on what we would have done had we been commissioned to make the next Mass Effect game. So from Mass Effect 4 onwards, we're going to attempt to tell a story that is still set, spoiler, is still set in the Milky Way galaxy. And we're going to have to canonize an ending, and you'll have to tune in to find out about that. It's still a work in progress at this point. So with that being said, I wanted to say one more thing before kind of giving you a bit of space to say a few things. But I also wanted to say that basically, I've just lost it for now, so maybe I'll let you have.
I'll say something, and if you remember it, you can.
Yeah.
So it's sort of carrying on from what you said, but I think that the decision BioWare made to move away from the sort of pre-established universe in the Milky Way is probably the biggest mistake they've made in the entire, out of the whole game. Any mistakes in the actual game stem from the fact that they decided to sort of run away from the pre-established and loved universe that they had already created. And my sort of problem with that is they're expecting us to enjoy the game instantly when actually they're sort of building a game that isn't Mass Effect, if that makes sense. So they're moving away from everything that made Mass Effect, which was it was set in our universe. It was in and around star clusters around Earth. It was sort of our future, whereas this game is sort of it's taken that step just beyond science fiction, and now it really is just kind of like a fantasy universe. Basically, it's no different to Star Wars now. Basically, it's just humans in another galaxy rather than us in the future.
Yeah, well, it's funny you mentioned that. So actually, that does now remind me of what I was going to say. It's funny. So sorry, you haven't finished?
No, that was basically it. There isn't much to say. It speaks for itself, kind of. But,
yeah. Well, your fantasy point is quite important here as well. In the original trilogy, they sort of explain how you can get from solar system to solar system by these Mass Effect, generators or whatever that fast travel you basically. In this one, you don't have that, but you can still just go around the Andromeda galaxy as you want. It doesn't make sense to me either. So it is definitely more of a fantasy game, and with that in mind, this is I think going to be put as the title of this as well, of this video, but I believe that Andromeda is actually a spin-off and it's not part of the main series. I think that for example, what they should do is they should make the game that we're going to do videos on soon, in my opinion, but there you go. And I think this should be counted as either non-canon or spin-off territory, because they did, like you say, they went away from this established world that people knew and loved, and that's why one of the big reasons why they wanted to play Mass Effect. And so I think if they came out and said this was a spin-off title, then I think people could probably accept it a little bit more and swallow it a little bit more. And I actually think that it would almost score higher, because then you're treating it as a standalone game, and as a standalone game, actually, it's not that terrible.
Yeah.
But like I said, we want to talk about this both as a standalone and in the context of, the trilogy. So if it was a standalone, I actually think I would score it more like a 6 out of 10. The story
I
would
think
still
my
not be
score
strong.
would, yeah.
Yeah, the story would still not be strong. The wow factor would be a little bit higher. The expectations would be there, therefore, in my opinion, a little bit easier to compare. So it'd probably score higher on that. And I think it'd probably score more like a 6 out of 10, slightly above average. But they didn't. They didn't say that. They haven't done that. And therefore, that's why the score is there. But for me, Andromeda shouldn't be called Mass Effect Andromeda. It should just be called Andromeda, because for me, it's a complete spin-off.
Yep, I agree.
Okay.
I completely agree.
All right. Well, do you have any more points before we skedaddle?
No, I don't really have anything specific aside from that point that we've sort of already made, and sort of everything about the characters and whatnot. But yeah, I just think the main mistake they made was before they even started making the game was starting the game by abandoning everything we already knew and loved in the original Mass Effect. And that's probably my biggest problem with it overall.
I would agree. And I guess on that note, we'll just say stay tuned. The coming soon will be a 3-parter in terms of how we would write the next Mass Effect trilogy, Mass Effect 4, 5, and 6. So as I said, that we're not people that will just critique and sit back as armchair critics. We want to actually get stuck in and say why, not only why do we think this didn't work, but this is how we would have done it and what we think would have worked. Once we put those videos up, feel free to criticize us or add things onto us. And we're always looking for more suggestions of which games we want to sort of pull apart and dismantle and reassemble and everything like that. So let us know what you'd like to hear us talk about, and if we can talk about it and give it justice, then we absolutely will. But yeah, until next time.
Yep. Until next time.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.